Well, Fernando, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Is the sound working? Excellent, good. Well, first of all, it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be able to be here today to talk about this notion of green supply chains with you. And when I was looking at the speakers that have participated in this conference in the past, I realized it's an incredible list, so it's a very tough act to be able to follow. And in fact, I was also just listening to Jonathan Burns' presentation earlier, and very much enjoyed that, because about 15 years ago, when I was still doing some supply chain partnership consulting back in Europe, at that time already, Jonathan Burns was one of the leading figures in supply chain partnerships and very influential on the work that we were doing at the time. And it was great to just hear all those things reconfirmed. But then I also wondered, in fact, began to realize that what Jonathan was talking about, and this notion of supply chain partnerships and all the financial benefits you can get from them, they actually apply very strongly to what we'll be talking about here in the world of green supply chains. And everything, in fact, that I'll be showing you on environmental issues in supply chains is very much based on the notion of having good partnerships with customers and with suppliers. So you could almost say, take everything you saw in that last hour before lunch and then add the word environmental to it, and it still works exactly the same way. So in other words, you shouldn't think of the talk I'll give here about green supply chains as something completely different. And you have to choose, am I going to do supply chain partnership the way Dr. Burns was talking about, or should I spend all my energy doing environmental things? In fact, the two go very, very nicely hand in hand. And I hope that by the end of the session I'll have given you some ideas and suggestions on how that would actually work. Another comment I'd like to make also is I saw that in the program there are different headings for different sessions, and this heading for this session in your program is tendencias, which I believe means trends. Now, when you hear the word trend, of course, you can think of two things. One is trendy, fashionable, fashion, a short-term fad, meaning something that's a big trend now but will disappear in a few years' time. But the other meaning of the word trend is something that starts and just builds and gets bigger and bigger and bigger and just continues to trend upwards. And I really would like to emphasize, when we talk about green supply chains in the examples I give you, you should keep that second definition of the word trend in mind. It's something which is coming and it's growing, and it's absolutely not going away. Now, certainly there's some years there'll be a little bit more hype and some years a little bit less hype, but the underlying trend of greening supply chains is absolutely, definitely a long-term trend. So that's why there's a lot to talk about. And sometimes I've noticed when talking about green supply chains in various countries, for instance, in Turkey a few weeks ago, one of the responses that you get is, well, you know, in some Western European countries like, say, Germany or Denmark, they're so far ahead and they have different regulation and different governments and so on. So yeah, maybe they can do these things, or maybe some parts of the United States can do these things. But in most of the rest of the world, this is just not, it's not an issue yet. But I don't want you to be fooled by all the noise and the hype that you see happening in green supply chains, because honestly, across the world, in any country you look at, in any company you look at, everybody is just at the beginning stage. So even though I show you lots of examples of what is happening and trends that are emerging in green supply chains, it's not so that these are things that companies have been doing for 10, 20, 30 years. So if you haven't started, you're way behind. In fact, everybody is very much in the very early learning stages of this development. Now, the other thing, of course, I should also say is just a very happy birthday to Syntec and to this conference. Again, this is the 10th Visum conference. So feliz cumpleaños, and I hope you're having a great party as well as a good conference. I'd like to add one comment before I start the actual presentation. You've already noticed probably that I have a bit of an unusual accent, and my history is part British, part Dutch, part France, part Tennessee, and then now in California. And I realize that that's done very strange things for my accent. I also know that I often speak very fast. So one request I would like to make to all of you as the audience is if I start speaking too quickly, or if I suddenly start speaking Dutch, if you could please say something or do something to slow me down, right? So if you can give me the signal, slow down, I do appreciate that. Because I have a lot more to tell you than I can possibly do in 1 hour, and if I get excited, I will start speaking quickly. So honestly, please do ask me to slow down. Is that a deal? Great. I hear about half the people say yes, the other half are probably not sure what I asked, but I really do mean that. All right, what I'd like to also just put things in perspective, when you hear somebody talk about green supply chains, of course you often can wonder, so what is that person's environmental belief? What are their personal beliefs? So this is not obviously the kind of person I am, but there are still people out there who honestly believe that global warming is not happening, and even though you get these big snowflakes, 100-pound snowflakes, beating them on the head, they still say, nope, global warming is not happening. This is not me, obviously. But this is also not me. There's the other extreme. In the United States or in the English language, there's the expression called tree hugger. Right? These are the activists who hug trees and they just love nature so much that nothing else matters. The extreme activists. This is not me either. I'm very much looking at the environment as a business issue more than either one of these two extremes. So when you listen to the rest of the presentation, keep in mind where these views are coming from. Now, supply chains, we've all seen many different pictures, I think, of what a supply chain looks like. Here's just a standard, typical representation of a value chain where goods flow from packaging, sourcing, supply chain design, actually physically designing the structure, managing the supply chain, the logistics, the kind of thing most of you do every day, managing your internal processes inside your warehouse, your factory, or the marketing and outreach to customers. And in the previous talk, you heard how Jonathan was talking about each of these steps as part of a supply chain partnership process. But there's all sorts of things happening now to make these supply chains really confusing. And so first of all, of course, there's all these names that we know, the big customers, the Walmarts, the Tesco's, the Carrefours, the Costco's, and others, that are out there trying to green the supply chain, right? Even if we're not quite sure what that means. And there's all sorts of pressure coming on the supply chain from big, powerful customers like that. There's also all sorts of pressures coming from governments. And then there's from the European government, American governments, other governments, global treaties, the Kyoto Protocol. There's all kinds of governmental agreements that are changing the way supply chains will look and behave and be operated. And there's also all kinds of standards and certifications and labels and things suddenly popping up. Some of these are very familiar, ISO 9000, ISO 14000. Some of these are much newer and less known, all kinds of organic labels and other things. So consumers, final consumers, people like you and me are suddenly seeing all these things on products and getting concerned. And on top of that, technology is changing things too, and between information technology, RFID chips, the internet, etc., biofuel, bioenergy, supply chains are starting to change. So you take all these things together, you can imagine that the supply chains today are just under so many different pressures to adopt as a result of environmental movements that it's hard to know where to begin. But the good news is there are very many opportunities and not just challenges or problems here. In fact, I say the opportunities are the main part. I'll just give you a couple of indications that these are really long-term trends, the way I just started out with, that companies, large companies across the world, believe that the environmental problems are here to stay and that the environmental strategies are becoming increasingly important. So I pulled out a number of different surveys from the last 6 months to 1 year done by major consulting firms, and all of them show the same thing. So this is one from McKinsey that asked the question, and I realize this is probably hard to read in the back, but it's, which of the following trends do you think are most important in influencing society's expectations of business? And the most important trend that CEOs of companies across the world mentioned was basically environmental issues. The number one trend on the mind of CEOs of top companies across the world. PricewaterhouseCoopers fairly recently did a survey of technology executives, asking them what are the issues that you're facing, every issue, not just environmental issues. And they asked, the question was, do you see very strong or strong demand in terms of green demand for the product you sell? And look at what they say, regardless of where the customer base is, if it's business customers, government customers, or consumers, they see today already a strong demand, and in 2 years from now, they see a much bigger demand still for environmental attributes in their products. They see, for instance, that today, the shift towards green products exacts, say, a major or moderate impact on their sourcing or supply chain, but in just a few years, 55% think that this is really going to change the way supply chains operate. And there's more examples like that. In just a 2 years' time, more than half of the firms think that environmental attributes will be key parts of supply chain design and decisions on which